Good morning and good afternoon or early evening, wherever you may be in the world at the moment. Welcome to an Ethical Corporation by Reuters Events webinar on climate disclosures. I'm Ed Long, Head of US Operations at Ethical Corporation. Amid ever greater revelations about the severity of climate change, there's been patchy progress in adopting the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures on reporting climate risks. Have the TCFDs had the desired effect to prompt companies to adopt more sustainable business, or are they just another box-ticking exercise to get investors off their back? To help you understand the latest approaches, 4 senior leaders are ready to share their insights in a 1-hour interactive webinar debate. Joining us today, we have Eliza Eubank, the Managing Director and Global Head of Environmental and Social Risk Management at Citi, Rishi Desai, Director, Environmental and Social Risk at UBS, Simon Fishwicker, Senior Manager of Corporate Engagement at CDP, Meredith Block, Senior ESG Analyst and Senior Vice President of Rockefeller Capital Management. And today the session will be moderated by Mariantina Leana, Senior Consultant at Southpol. Today's 1-hour webinar will be in the form of a panel discussion. On the right-hand side, you'll see a box where you can post your questions. Please do post your key questions throughout the discussion, and we'll aim to get these answered for you hopefully within the hour. And it's my pleasure to hand over to Mariantina to get the discussions underway.
Great. Thank you so much for this, Ed. Hello, my name is Mariantina. As Ed mentioned, I am a senior consultant working for Southpol's climate strategy team. Just a couple of words about Southpol. Southpol is a provider of global climate change solutions and services established in 2006. And we work with leading private and public sector actors on accelerating the low carbon transition. The topic of our discussion today is climate disclosures, accurately reporting climate impacts, risks, and opportunities. In this context, there are 3 key messages from the Task Force's latest status report on TCFD that are worth mentioning in our session. The first one is that disclosure of climate-related financial information has increased since 2016, but it is still insufficient for investors. The way forward is still long. Secondly, probably our most challenging topic of the day, it is no surprise that more clarity is needed on the potential financial impact of climate-related issues on organizations. Finally, the majority of companies using scenarios, 3 out of 5 more precisely, do not disclose information on the resilience of their strategies. So organizations are still early in the process of using the climate-related scenarios internally. They are still learning how to integrate scenarios into corporate strategy processes. In our panel discussion today, we have 3 participants from financial institutions and 1 expert on disclosure. We are going to focus on the areas of overarching TCFD issues for the financial community, insights from assessing risks and opportunities, and of course, the catalytic role that disclosure plays in pushing the implementation of TCFD recommendations forward. We will kick off the discussion through inviting each participant to provide us with a quick overview of their work on climate disclosures, and then we will have an interactive Q&A session. So please, as Ed mentioned, feel free to submit your questions via the chat box function on your right. At this point, and with no further delay, I would like to invite our first speaker, Eliza, to start with her contribution. Eliza, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariantina, and thanks to everyone joining out there. I hope everyone is keeping healthy and sane in these crazy times. So I'm Eliza Eubank. I'm the Global Head of Environmental and Social Risk Management at Citi. I've been in this space at Citi for almost 13 years now. Historically, it's been more focused on project-related finance, equator principles type work, but over time, our analysis has grown from the projects we finance to the clients, and companies in environmentally and socially sensitive sectors. And it's been really interesting the last few years since TCFD was finalized, the focus to portfolio level analysis of environmental risks, of climate risks. And so, cities working closely with our peer institutions to figure out how we do that. Because of course, in order to disclose our climate risks, we need to be able to understand them, to analyze them, quantify them. And that's very complicated. It's not an easy task. And so at Citi, we're working on TCFD implementation on a number of fronts. I think climate risk has always been incorporated into the ESRM policy that I manage, as one environmental risk on a long list of environmental and social risks. But it feels like in the last couple of years it's sort of taken over everything, because we need to move beyond understanding individual projects and activities, how they are impacted by climate change and how they can impact the climate, to how it's going to lead to economy-wide shifts. So, we are doing a lot of work on climate scenario analysis. We are evaluating the emerging climate data providers, looking at the increasing disclosures that are coming out of our own clients, and the regulatory guidance, that's coming out across the world. I'm assuming people who signed up for this webinar are familiar with the Network on Greening the Financial System, NGFS, and how there's over 54 central banks across the world who are committing to start integrating climate risk into how they look at banks. That's really helping to drive the conversation within banks, up to the board level of focus. So, we are updating senior management regularly. We have pulled in cross-functional working groups across the institutions to start attacking the challenge. And we put out our own first TCFD report in November 2018, and we'll be doing another one this year. I think we'll get into some of the details of all of that work in follow-on questions. So, I think I won't go into detail in too much of that there, just to say that this is a very rapidly evolving space. There's a lot of people involved in it across Citi, and we know that we need to continually improve our own analysis and our own disclosures, and we're working with a number of peers on that. And I look forward to talking to you all more about that over the next hour.
Great. Thank you so much for this, Eliza. Our next speaker is Rishi to provide us with UBS perspective on this. Rishi, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariantina. Yes, so my name is Rishi Desai. I'm a director in the Environmental and Social Risk Unit for UBS. I'm based in New York. The team is a global team and is responsible for the firm's climate change disclosure efforts, as well as the firm's climate risk efforts. A few notes on our climate strategy. So UBS climate strategy underlines our commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals on climate action and on affordable and clean energy, and supports an orderly transition to low carbon economy as defined by the Paris Agreement. Our strategy is built on four major pillars. First is to protect our own assets. As a bank, we seek to protect our assets by limiting our risk appetite for carbon-related assets, loans, and other collateral assets. We estimate our firm's vulnerability to climate risks using scenario-based stress testing approaches, something that I'll go into a bit more detail later, and we've been doing this since 2014. We've reduced those assets, those carbon-related assets or high carbon assets, by over 40% since last year. The second pillar, we protect our clients' assets. So we support our clients' efforts in assessing and managing and protecting them from climate-related risks by offering innovative products and services and investments, financing, and research. And I'll go in a bit more detail about that later. We also support an engagement strategy through our asset management division with companies in high carbon sectors. Third, we've mobilized private and institutional capital. So we mobilize private and institutional capital towards investments facilitating climate change mitigation and adaptation and supporting the transition to a low carbon economy as a corporate advisor and with our lending capacity. And finally, we reduce our direct climate impact. So this is our operational greenhouse gas emissions with the goal to source 100% in renewable energy by mid-2020. Our disclosure follows the recommendations outlined by the TCFD. The most recent disclosure you can find available on our website was published in early March. We've committed to aligning our climate disclosure with the 5-year pathway outlined by TCFD through the end of 2022, but also to collaborate within the industry to close gaps in aligning with that climate disclosure. And we'll go into some detail about those collaborations when we talk more about scenario analysis. A few other high-level notes of our disclosure. So, as I said, our exposure to high carbon assets or carbon-related assets on our banking balance sheet is now very low at below 1% or 1.9 billion as of end of last year. It's a 40% reduction from the year previous, and further reduced from the year previous to that. Our climate-related sustainable investments have increased from 108 billion last year. To 108 billion last year from 90 billion the year before. And we actively engage with over 50 oil and gas and utilities companies on climate-related TCFD-aligned disclosures. And finally, our greenhouse gas footprint has been reduced by 71% till 2019 since 2004. Our disclosures are also externally rated well. We were awarded top ratings by Dow Jones Sustainability Index and CDP several years running, and best performing asset manager in proxy voting by Share Action last year.
Great. Thank you very much, Rishi, for your input. Now I would like to invite Meredith from Rockefeller Capital Management to proceed with. Meredith, please proceed with your overview. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary and Tina, and hello, everyone. I'm Meredith with Rockefeller Capital Management, and I am a senior analyst in the asset management division. And Rockefeller Asset Management actually has its origins as the Rockefeller family office, and it was really in the 4th generation of Rockefellers where they wanted to align their philanthropy more closely with their investments. And so the legacy of climate risk assessment and climate shareholder activism actually stretches back to the 1970s. And so, today, as we run basically long-only, fairly concentrated public equity portfolios, over 94% of our AUM is subject to deep ESG fundamental research. And a large part of that actually is deep engagement with our portfolio holdings. It's absolutely critical to our assumptions in terms of measuring climate risks and resiliency. So to identify the risks, the majority of our companies undergo a bottom-up assessment that really considers a company's past emissions performance, their strategy to reduce emissions, the regulatory and physical risks within their operations, and of course the risks to their product portfolio from oil demand and technology disruption. In terms of disclosure, when the TCFD were finalized, the guidelines were finalized in 2018, Rockefeller began to conduct at that time portfolio climate scenario analysis and stress testing. And we decided to join a United Nations Environment Program Finance Initiative TCFD investor pilot project to see how we could run our fundamental assumptions gleaned through fundamental research through top-down models and scenarios that consider the different regulatory and physical risks associated with the different emissions pathways. And we've disclosed our risks along the TCFD framework to the best of our abilities for the past 2 years. But really what we found going through that exercise, definitely surprised us. We were one of 20 investors that participated in this pilot, but we were the only US representative, and also I believe the only asset manager that specifically mostly runs concentrated public equity portfolios. And so what surprised us is that actually when we ran our portfolios through the modeling and scenario tools that were available that we built through this pilot project, we actually found that our fundamental assumptions ran counter to the results of the top-down analysis, and that's something I can get into a bit more later. And this led us to a number of conclusions that I hope to discuss, but really the main message here is that we believe that the data is not necessarily robust enough for this to be just a quantitative exercise to really understand the climate risks and opportunities that a company faces and subsequently your portfolio faces, and that climate risk, particularly to investment portfolios, need to be considered on a company by company basis, as well as a top-down quantitative approach. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meredith. Simon, please proceed with your perspective from a disclosure point of view. Thank you. Simon, maybe you're on mute. Simon, can you hear us? Ed, I'm not sure whether you can unmute Simon.
He's self-muted, Mariantina. Do you want to move on to the next questioning?
Sure. Okay, yes, sounds good. Then thank you so much, everyone, for your input. Very interesting to hear everyone's perspective. So before we start discussing about TCFD and disclosure and the detail of both of these topics, I feel that we have all been affected by the crisis caused by COVID-19. So I would like to ask you to share your experience and insights here. So my question here would be around, how has your organization navigated through the COVID-19 crisis? What has been the impact so far that you have experienced, and are there any primary lessons learned on resilience, really? Eliza, maybe you can start responding to this question, please.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think these are unprecedented times, obviously. And as the world's most global bank, we're certainly feeling that.
Hear me?
Oh, Simon, yes.
Yeah,
there you are.
sorry. I rejoined via phone. This was, I guess, bound to happen on something like this. Do you mind if I do my intro quickly?
No, please, maybe, yeah,
okay.
Do your intro quickly and then we can proceed with the COVID topic.
Sorry about that, everyone. I will be quick. Yeah, thanks, Mariantina. Excited to be on this panel. Simon Fishwiker, I'm the Senior Manager of Corporate Engagement at CDP. I imagine most are familiar, but CDP is a nonprofit that runs a global disclosure system. We enable companies, cities, states, and regions to measure and manage environmental impacts and disclose this information to their investors and customers. My role is to lead our team here in North America that is engaging the companies across all sectors requested by their investors and customers to disclose to CDP's climate, forest, and water security programs. In Canada and the US, that represents around 2,000 companies who submitted in 2019, including 72% of the S&P 500. As it relates to TCFD, in 2018, CDP did integrate the recommendations from the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures into our climate change questionnaire to provide companies and investors a structured and comparable mechanism for TCFD-aligned disclosure, with the goal to kind of meet the demands of my colleagues on the call in terms of the data, both from a qualitative and quantitative perspective. We found when we went through that exercise that CDP's sort of 20-year approach to voluntary climate change disclosure did align with a number of the recommendations across governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. But we did need to modify and address new elements that connect financial risk and climate risk in a more robust manner. This included more questions on board-level oversight of climate change, integrating climate-related scenario analysis into our questionnaire, and drawing more connections between financial impact and our questions on climate-related risk and opportunity. Finally, we also integrated more sector-specific quantitative metrics for high-carbon sectors like electric utilities, oil and gas, metals and mining, food, beverage, and agriculture, amongst others. Ultimately, the goal here was to align our questionnaire with the TCFD recommendations in order to turn those recommendations into actionable metrics that thousands of companies could use in their disclosures. And by doing so, our goal was to help create metrics to collect, report on them, and inform best practice. And in turn, the 8,400 plus companies that end up reporting to CDP in 2019 are now providing that structured and comparable TCFD aligned data set to investors and the ESG marketplace. Thank you for letting me jump in to introduce myself, and I'll go back on mute.
Great, great. Thank you so much for this, Simon, and no worries at all. So going back to our question before about the COVID-19 crisis and how your organizations have been navigating through the crisis, what the impact so far is, and whether there are any primary lessons learned that maybe you would like to share with us. And Elisa, please go ahead with responding to this question. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, definitely, on the corporate side, corporate and institutional client side, where Citi's been working around the clock to help our institutional clients navigate volatile markets and manage their business needs as economic impacts of the pandemic continue to evolve. In treasury and trade business, we're creating new solutions and services for our clients to support their supply chains and liquidity optimization. And making sure that our clients are able to still deliver payments through this crisis. And we're also on the consumer side. We're continuing to serve our clients. Some bank branches are still open to reduced hours as an essential service. We are doing fee waivers on monthly service fees, waiving penalties for early CD withdrawals, a number of ways we're trying to recognize that a lot of our consumer bank clients are in a difficult position with the, increasing unemployment claims. And in the Citi Foundation, we've also donated $15 million to COVID-19 related relief activities globally. And we have, Citi has over 220,000 employees globally. The vast majority of those are working from home, so our operations and technology teams are all working on the right technology to make sure we're still able to provide all the services of a global bank with the security necessary, while we're on our remote work platforms. I think for the pivoting to the climate side, I think, a lot of the focus within the financial sector has been on climate scenario analysis. Citi, was the other US bank participant in the UNEP-FI pilot that Meredith mentioned, because scenario analysis is a helpful tool for us to try and understand how our portfolios may be stressed under the uncertain futures that you may try to predict scenarios of in climate change. COVID-19 is now the scenario analysis and stress testing that's happening in banks, and we're some of that work is momentarily pivoted to COVID-19 scenario analysis and stress testing, but I think it's giving us a lot of we're going to end this pandemic with a lot of lessons learned about how we may try to analyze how a climate crisis may manifest itself in our portfolio. We're seeing right now that corporations have the ability to make rapid, voluntary actions in response to an acute crisis. We're seeing that individuals have the ability to make drastic behavioral changes in response to an acute crisis, and that governments, are able to mobilize and take action. So switching to climate, I think the challenge that we all face in that is that it's not an acute crisis yet. It's a slower moving crisis, and we're trying to deliver the message that action now is important to avoid, more acute crises in the future. But we know at least that the world is able to come together and act on a lot of different fronts to attack a problem. And so I'd like to see both, number one, how this scenario analysis and stress testing that's happened right now with COVID will give us lessons learned for better climate scenario analysis in the future. And again, it's heartening to know that the world is able to take action, and I hope that we're able to take more action on climate moving forward.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. This is it's a very positive and an interesting message. Thank you so much for this. Rishi, I was wondering whether you could share with us your own perspective as well from UBS.
Sure. For UBS, as a global business, UBS has been tracking the outbreak since it first appeared in Asia, and the bank has put in measures to support clients through this time. So, starting with helping to get funding and supplies to the people who need them most, and in this regard, similarly, our foundation has put forward $30 million to Corona relief efforts. The bank, as an employee of UBS, I can say that they've done a great job in supporting flexible working arrangements, work from home arrangements, obviously, but also protecting the safety and answering questions for employees, our clients, and the families, and supporting our families through this time. Our wealth management business has been active in helping clients navigate this time, adapting to the risks and safeguarding their financial positions, and answering questions on making decisions in this unpredictable period. Switching to the climate topic, I think Eliza said it well, that this is an acute crisis that differs in the structure from climate, but I think that there are a few lessons emerging, economic and human costs that we can start to identify. The first is on preparedness. So for both sort of climate and Corona, we sort of see that the world, there's a gap in preparedness, and investing in preparedness early can reduce economic costs and human lives later. And so some of the numbers emerging show economic impact from 1 trillion to 4 trillion on Corona. Similarly, when we think about the research on climate, estimates of damages are approaching about 7 to 8 trillion per year by the middle of the century. But these numbers can be reduced with earlier investments, as these studies show us, and I think that there's a lesson here on preparing the world for these eventualities, these natural eventualities. The second thing, and I think this was said well, is that this is a time that we're seeing with Corona, the world coming together in a targeted way to solve the acute crisis. Governments, science, business, and individuals and their individual decision-making and consumption patterns are coming together to address the crisis, the acute crisis, in a way that should bring a touch of optimism, because that's essentially what we're asking for and what is needed for addressing the climate crisis. When I see this type of coordinated action on a chronic issue, the last one that I can think of that relates to climate that the world really did come together and address was on CFCs and the Montreal Protocol, and that was one where we saw this targeted action coming together. The protocol provided the platform, but the world also worked together to implement it and achieve their targets, so that we could address the growing hole in the ozone layer. This is essentially what I'm optimistic will come out of the post-Corona analysis, and that we will have a sort of a way to work together towards these goals. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rishi, also for your positive message about the world working together against this crisis. At this point, also, Meredith, what would be your view on this topic?
Yeah, thanks. So, I'll start by, echoing Eliza and Rishi's comments by saying that, while COVID-19 has been, acute and devastating, we know it will likely be temporary, whereas climate change is chronic, devastating, and likely permanent. So the way in which Rockefeller feels we can do our part is, of course, by dealing with the short-term dislocations to preserve client capital, but also not losing focus on long-term risks. So in continuing with many of our scheduled engagements with our portfolio companies, whether it's been on human rights or climate change, we of course have been starting with a discussion on protecting the health of the global workforce, because we are largely in large cap public equities with sizable workforces. And so actually hearing how a company is handling its workforce during this time, I think has been a great way of understanding the environmental health and safety governance within a company. And we found that particularly with our industrials and our energy names that have strong environmental health and safety governance to begin with, it's been relatively easier for them to deploy appropriate personal protective equipment and safety procedures while maintaining production in several sectors. And since climate change is really a major focus of engagement across our portfolio, it really takes a different shape depending on the business model of our investee entities. And so just, tying this back to the topic of today's discussion, what we're seeing right now in oil and gas in the last few weeks, I think has been really interesting with the double hit of both, a drop in factory output and transportation demand from COVID, and of course the Saudi-Russia price war. And so it's making discussions around the importance of climate scenario planning, lowering the cost of supply, and of course the potentially uneconomic exploitation of reserves increasingly relevant. And so, we've seen it now as sort of a perfect time to, step on the gas in engaging with, energy companies in particular on the importance of climate scenario planning, in addition to other scenario planning. I mean, we've seen cuts to capex for some E&P companies, which of course is a benefit from a climate perspective. And then, I guess just finally, just to echo what was said before, I think that we have really seen that, if there's a will, there's a way when it comes to action on climate. And so I think what we really have here is a political problem more than a logistical one. And the situation with COVID-19 has certainly proved that in my mind.
Wonderful. Thank you, Meredith. And last but not least, Simon, could you share with us also CDP's perspective here?
Sure. Yeah, and I think, for us, the first order of business was to ensure that our 300 or so staff around the world, ranging from Beijing to Berlin to London to Spain, Italy, and New York, were safe, healthy, and had what they needed to continue to move our work on climate, forest, and water disclosure forward. But after that, we've been doing a lot to reach out to our stakeholders who are the cities, companies, and investors we work with to understand how the coronavirus crisis is impacting them and their ability to engage with CDP disclosure and action on climate change, including continuing to hit their ambitious science-based targets or targets around renewable energy, or continue to advance their sort of plans around TCFD disclosure. And in those conversations, I think we've learned that some companies will have some challenges. For instance, new renewable installations are stalled. But I think what's been most exciting is some of the conversations where most of the companies have basically said, this for us is reinforcing the importance of our sustainability work, our drive on managing climate change, and we're pushing forward with the level of ambition that we have been planning to, and I think it's not surprising to see that simultaneous to this crisis, we're still seeing companies making commitments to science-based targets in this time frame. So really excited and inspired to see that has not kind of changed any of the momentum we've seen in the past years. But as an organization that does work with those stakeholders, we have been evaluating potential adjustments to our own timelines and policies for the 2020 disclosure cycle. And just for any company on the line that is, a disclosing entity to CDP, we are finalizing some changes that will be communicated more broadly next week. But I'll leave it there so we can get into some of the content ahead of us.
Thank you, Simon, and everyone for your input here. Indeed, the situation is challenging, but what I hear from everyone is that the world is coming together to respond to an acute crisis with optimism. So now moving forward to our first thematic, which is around overarching TCFD issues for the financial community. At first place, my question is going to be for our participants from financial institutions here. So we are all keen to understand how the TCFD recommendations are being utilized by the financial services community. So I would like to invite you primarily, Meredith, to respond to this.
Sure, thanks. So, as an asset management firm, most of our climate risks and opportunities are really within our portfolio companies or investee entities. And so, in my opinion, actually, the real genius of the TCFD is that asset managers are subject to report against it, just as our portfolio companies are. But unfortunately, this means that we really need our portfolio holdings to disclose along the TCFD so that we can use the data in aggregate across our portfolios. So, engaging on this point has really become critical to our investment research process, as well as our portfolio maintenance process. And so, in general, we use a company's TCFD disclosure to really understand how well climate risks are integrated into the business, really from an enterprise risk management perspective. Rockefeller accepts that the fundamental premise that climate change, will have and is having an impact on global markets. So it's so important for us to really understand that our investments have the same level of understanding and are therefore taking the appropriate steps, towards resiliency planning. And so, we really try and understand risk management approaches such as emissions reduction target setting, remuneration tied to energy or emissions reduction, capital expenditures for efficiency improvements, targets for renewable power, capital allocation towards, less carbon intensive business lines, among other things. And so the TCFD framework really offers a great guideline for us to receive this information. And so for any corporates on the line, I just want to say to you, please take your TCFD disclosures seriously, because otherwise your investors are just guessing. And so own your climate narrative. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much for this, Meredith. Rishi, is there anything else that you would like to add here?
Yeah, just a quick note. So, I mean, with respect to using the TCFD, we're a global firm with both an investment banking and an investment banking and an asset management and wealth management division. So we look at TCFD broadly in not just on our own disclosures, but as well in those companies that we finance and invest in. So the recommendations that they call on the disclosure of climate change impacts on these businesses that we finance and invest in, but they also allow investors and financial institutions like us to make better investment decisions, as Meredith was sort of talking about. And our sort of ideal state here is that our investees and our clients in our investment bank would be disclosing TCFD, and it provides that platform for a common set of data to assess climate-related risks and opportunities in these specific companies. To that end, our asset management division engages with, as I said before, engages with companies in high carbon sectors like oil and gas and power utilities towards, and has a strategy of engagement with one of its climate-aware funds towards TCFD disclosure and performance. This is also sort of reinforced through our Climate Action 100 plus membership and engagements conducted through that program as well. So, when we're looking ahead, for the next few years, we're hoping that, that companies do start to disclose more in line with TCFD to enable better decision making and financing policies at our banking level and our investment division.
Great. Thanks for this. So our next, my next question is a bit more disclosure oriented. So we understand that CDP is launching a financial services sector-specific questionnaire here. So how will this impact the continued uptake of TCFD-aligned disclosures? And Simon, you mentioned a couple of things before, but I was wondering whether you can elaborate on what is different about this approach.
Sure. Thanks, Mariantina. So, I think from our perspective, the financial sector, and I think Meredith said this well, specifically, looking at indirect financing impacts were a key focus of the TCFD recommendations. Therefore, for us, developing a financial sector questionnaire was a key step in aligning CDP's questionnaire with the TCFD recommendations. And so building on that current sort of TCFD aligned core questions on governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets in the climate change questionnaire this year, we're expanding the focus of the disclosure request that we make of asset managers, banks, and insurance companies to include more topics like how those companies are considering the lending, investment, and underwriting portfolios, with climate change in mind. So what steps are asset managers, banks, and insurance companies taking to assess their portfolio's exposure to climate-related risks and opportunities? To Rishi's point, are you actively engaging with clients and investees on climate-related issues, both from an investment and a lending perspective? So really looking at the banking sector as well, and whether climate-related information is requested during those initial due diligence or risk assessment practices. So I think to really ensure that the capital is flowing towards those companies that are cities and municipal kind of entities that are considering climate risk as part of their process. And then also looking at whether these entities are integrating climate-related issues into any existing policy frameworks, whether they're implementing climate-related exclusions across any of their lending, investing, or underwriting insurance portfolios. And then from a quantitative perspective, starting to talk with these asset managers, banks, and insurance companies about what analysis they're doing to understand how their portfolio impacts the climate, particularly whether they calculate and report the emissions that are affiliated with their portfolio, so that tricky Scope 3 category 15 investments, highlighting that only about 1/5 of the disclosing financial institutions to CDP in 2019 actually disclosed this figure. And I think there's an understanding that there's a lot of work to be done to firm up standardized methodologies on this, but it's an important indicator that we can kind of work collectively on. And finally, just recognizing that CDP is not alone in this space. We've done a lot to ensure that our approach is harmonized with efforts such as PRIs or the recently launched UN Principles for Responsible Banking or Principles for Sustainable Insurance, and SASB as well as others. So looking forward to the results of that disclosure this year.
Yes, we are all indeed. Thank you, Simon. So our next question is around internal engagement. So we know that nowadays sustainability strategy is not something that comes just from a sustainability corner of the organizations, but actual sustainability professionals need to work across different risk and business units here within their organizations in order to implement TCFD. So Eliza, my question here to you would be, how do you make sure that key internal stakeholders are engaged in Citi?
Yeah, thanks. It's an important question, because I think climate change has definitely been something that, within ESRM at Citi, within corporate sustainability at Citi, we've been focused on since, 2003. There's been many years we've been working on it. But now what's exciting is, it's no longer, in a silo, something separate. It's really the last few years with TCFD, it's a helpful framework for engagement, not just externally with our clients and with our investors, but also internally. And you have to break out of the silo in order to effectively implement TCFD. So in early 2019, Citi set up a broader climate risk working group, looking kind of cross-functional across risk. So very importantly, including our quantitative risk and stress testing teams, including people from credit risk, operational risk, and then outside of risk in the banking teams who cover these high carbon sectors, some legal advisors, et cetera. And I think we really work on identifying specific work streams where different participants across the bank can be helpful. So it's not just a general information sharing. There's a project that we're all working on. So, for example, with the scenario analysis and stress testing for the UNIP-FI pilot, we had bankers, credit risk managers, and quantitative stress testing folks doing the work to do that analysis. And then we made sure that we had the opportunity to present, those results at different senior management forums, on up to, we had a climate risk information update that went to the risk management committee of the board. Separate work stream, we're looking at cities' own physical climate risks to our own facilities. As a global bank, we have operations, data services, branches, offices all over the world. So we have a work stream with city realty services and operational risk and operations and technology to look at where may we have more vulnerabilities to physical climate risk across our global footprint. So I think it's important to identify all those hidden pockets of expertise and think creatively about how they may have a helpful view on the climate risk work and bring them all together and take a key message out of that to deliver up, upstairs to senior management and externally in reporting.
Very insightful. Thank you for this, Eliza. Moving on to our next thematic. So maybe at this point we can focus a bit more on recent opportunities, really. So my first question is going to be about climate scenario analysis, insights, challenges, and lessons learned. And also here I would like to also combine another question that we receive from the audience, which is around how do you ensure that your climate scenario analysis reflects the latest science and impacts on sectors and wider systems. So at this point, I would like to invite you, Rishi, for your response to respond.
Sure. I can give a bit of a history and where we've taken this on scenario analysis for UBS. Internally, UBS, we've been using scenario-based approaches to measuring climate risk since 2014, both physical and transition risks. We've done both top-down balance sheet stress testing, meaning firm-wide, looking at impacts on our balance sheet, but also operational incomes and physical assets. And we've done subsequently a targeted bottom-up analysis. I'm going to give you a brief history of that and our findings, so that the group can ask any questions as follow-up. So our initial 2014 top-down stress test tested our balance sheet's vulnerability firm-wide. We used our top-down stress testing methodology and framework and developed in-house a climate change scenario, which basically assumed, this is now the 2014 one, assumed that severe weather events would trigger government action around the world implementing carbon pricing. We looked at, as I said before, the financial assets of the firm, our loan book, but also the impacts to our operational income, revenue impacts, and as well our physical assets. The scenario therefore anticipated that there would be a worldwide shift away from coal and other fossil fuels to cleaner alternatives. The top-down test showed us that there was some moderate, low to moderate impacts, but what it told us was that there's a methodological challenge from purely a top-down test, and I think Meredith had alluded to this previously. What happened as a result is that we identified that we required further bottom-up targeted analysis of carbon-intensive sectors. So the next year, what we did was we went forward in 2015 and did a targeted bottom-up portfolio analysis of our oil and gas and electric utilities loan portfolios on a forward-looking basis, scenario-based analysis, assessing the impact of low fossil fuel price scenario, promoting the greater use of renewables, and enhancing energy efficiency standards. We calculated impacts to probability and default and aggregated company level results at the portfolio level. And we also assessed vulnerability of loan portfolios secured by real estate in Switzerland, as UBS is a Swiss bank, and that's where the majority of our real estate exposures are, but also the US, as we have the second highest is in the US, to physical climate risks by mapping, this is now in 2015, the location of these assets over using climate hazard toolkits. Both the top-down and bottom-up approaches suggested that there is no immediate threat to UBS's balance sheet, but I think more importantly here, the outcomes showed us that there were methodological and data challenges ranging from suitability of climate scenarios for banking risk modeling efforts to data availability like asset level data of companies in carbon intensive sectors, forward-looking information on their strategies, etc. So to address these challenges, we partnered with 16 other banks, including Citi, I believe this started in late 2017 or early 2018, and the UNEP, UN Environment Program Finance Initiative, but also partnered externally, that network partnered externally with the Integrated Assessment Modeling Consortium and risk consultancies like Oliver Wyman and Climatize. The consortium provided us with the most latest data and scenario information that we could use for our financial risk modeling efforts. So this is how we sort of stayed current on the science. And that partnership now continued in 2019 and 2020. We're currently in the second phase. The group has grown to 35 banks. And the objective is to further develop and address these methodological gaps and data gaps and build out the scenarios so that they align with emerging regulatory requests like those scenarios identified by the NGFS, which Eliza alluded to before, and the UK PRA, which is the bank regulator for the UK. Our objective is to further refine these methodologies and to address the data gaps and to bring standardization between institutions on what defines climate sensitive activities. So that effort's underway, and in addition, we also partnered with 2 Degrees Investing Initiative on testing the alignment analysis tool known as PACTA, Paris Agreement Capital Transition Assessment, and this piloting effort we did at the end of last year.
Great, thank you, Rishi. Meredith, would you like to provide us with your perspective as well? But at this point, I'm quite mindful of time. So as much as we can, because we still have some topics to cover, let's try to be a bit more brief. Thank you.
Sure, totally understood. And I think, as I alluded to before, and as Rishi pointed out, for us, the challenges with scenario model, there are some challenges in the data sets that have led to sort of a challenge in really trying to find the right scenarios, which I think, really depends on your business model. And so obviously for an asset manager, we're trying to do portfolio level assessments across all sectors. So maybe what I'll do in the interest of time is just talk about the key considerations that we're looking for any data providers on the line. I guess some shortcomings of some scenario analysis and stress testing. So some data gaps that we're looking to fill. So, one of our key considerations in modeling regulatory risks is that we really need to include scope 1, 2, and 3 data, as well as company targets and emission reduction rates. Because models that only consider scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, we found really create sector bias depending on how carbon is consumed along the value chain of the company. And just as evidence of this, we found that energy names actually did not comprise most of our regulatory and transition risk on an absolute or portfolio weighted basis when we use top-down scenario modeling. And then, which we disagree with. And then obviously, company-specific emissions trajectories really need to be included to capture, more accurate regulatory risk exposure, because so much of this, at least in the transition space, really hinges on where the policy discussion currently is at. And you kind of weigh that, versus the time horizon of your investments and your assumptions there. And then some key considerations that we're still looking for in being able to model physical risks is that facility quality and supply chain positioning are really critical in calculating the real cost of asset damage. Right? So like if we think about how the real cost of asset damages and repairs is tied much more to the intrinsic value of the asset than purely the asset's location. And we found that the highest risks to revenue disruption come from key locations in the value chain, as an extreme weather event could, stop a critical part of the manufacturing supply chain or shipping, versus just the pure location alone. And that weather damage could cost hundreds of millions of dollars in, needing to rebuild capital equipment, or lead to liabilities if waste storage facilities are damaged. And we have yet to find the physical modeling that can help us assess that. So, while we continue to look for developments in sort of the quantitative top-down modeling space, we continue, I think, to rely much more on our fundamental analysis to really key us into certain climate risks that our portfolio faces.
Okay, thank you. Interesting. Eliza, unless you have anything to add, maybe we can move to the next question.
Sure. I think we have 4 minutes left, right? So I don't know if we have our
Great.
key takeaways now, or
I think before we do that, maybe it's worth coming to a very hot topic, really, that we would like to see whether we can briefly address, which is the financial impact. And I would be very keen on hearing from each one of you what kind of challenges you have been experiencing in quantifying the monetary aspect of risk, methodological issues, what kind of data you have been using, what kind of metrics. So maybe Eliza, you can start with this.
Sure. Yeah, and I think Meredith, already, touched on, a lot of these challenges. But, climate, there's a lot of uncertainty due to the long-term time horizon. Future climate impacts are uncertain. They're expected to evolve over decades, and partly dependent on a range of policy decisions that may or may not be made today by governments, as well as companies. Impacts are global, but they're also local. There's differentiated impacts are going to be felt in different geographies and to different sectors. Climate change is going to impact the whole world, but you can't have one global view. So as a global bank, we can't say, okay, all of our power companies, we're going to discount by X, multiplied by their emissions of Y. It's going to be different in different markets. Is there a carbon price? What is their fuel mix? And so, and the data gaps, there's, physical risk analysis requires asset level data and future climate data at a high level of granularity, much of which, banks don't currently have. Their smart data providers that are working on it. And so I think we need to really move to a point where maybe there's more regulatory driven disclosures for all companies, of some way that could be decision useful for banks. There's more I could say, but looking at the time, I may leave it there.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Eliza. So indeed, we're running out of time. I feel that we could use an extra hour really to talk about so many related topics within this thematic. But at the same time, since we have only 2 minutes, what I would like to ask you at this point is, since maybe we're in the middle of the COVID emergency, and we tend to forget that we're also entering the decade of action when it comes to tackling climate change. So I would like to ask you for your views on where we need to be by 2030, and for your organizations, what is your plan for getting there? So maybe we can start, with getting Simon, your perspective from CDP here.
Sure. One thing I would note is that, right now, if we look at the state of disclosure in the S&P 500 as an indicator, about 72% are disclosing to CDP as an indicator of sort of TCFD aligned disclosure, and less than 10% of those companies have a science-based emission reduction target. I think not only do we need, 100% of that index kind of disclosing around TCFD metrics, but also having a science-based emission reduction target by 2030 and taking serious steps to achieve that target. So what are we doing to work on that? I think for one thing, we're looking to streamline and simplify our questionnaire to increase the uptake of it, and really try to focus more and more on the metrics that are most important We've gotten kind of input throughout time, and also continuing to focus companies and investors on science-based targets and those forward-looking metrics.
Great. Thank you. Meredith, what would be your main message here, please?
Sure. So essentially, asset managers and asset owners are really challenged in that a majority of public companies do not disclose climate risks with consistency, let alone the TCFD recommendation guidelines. And so this really makes aggregating portfolio exposures to certain risks imprecise and therefore not really appropriate as a basis for investment decisions. And so our plan to address this issue is really in 3 steps. First, to continue to conduct fundamental analysis of climate risks, engage our portfolio companies to adopt the TCFD recommendations, and then adopt the TCFD recommendation guidelines ourselves. Echoing Simon's points, we really need to accelerate both disclosure and action up to 2030. And I think that we've seen through this COVID crisis that where there's the political will, there's a way.
Great. Thanks for this, Meredith. And now moving to you, Rishi.
Yes. So by 2030. Ideally, we want to see more robust and better standardized disclosures from our investees and our clients. And so towards this end, we're pushing forward on our engagement strategy through asset management, but also looking at other ways of encouraging our clients to disclose their own climate-related risks and opportunities in line with TCFD recommendations. This would enable us to sort of make better decisions on and disclose better information on our own climate-related risks. For UBS specifically, we also look at action. So everything from integrating climate-related risks across the firm's risk management framework to building out climate strategy for developing climate-related opportunities through firm-wide functions and working groups. And finally, we see the regulatory agenda pushing forward the need for a robust approach to climate-related risk management and scenario analysis for banks and financial stability of our financial systems.
Great. Thank you very much, Rishi. And Eliza, your key message, being mindful of the fact that we're already too past.
Absolutely. I think I won't repeat what all my fellow panelists have said. I think they've well covered, what's needed in the financial sector. So I would just add to that, really, the financial sector, we're one piece of the puzzle. I think we also really what we need by 2030 is a global economy-wide price on carbon. So that these types of risks, really start to be internalized into financial markets together with some coordinated, government policy across the world on energy choices, because, all of that work to measure and understand climate risk, is helpful, but we need to be driving towards the ultimate goal of global economy decarbonization. And the financial sector is an important piece of that, but it needs to be acting in concert with a whole bunch of other actors, and there's an important role for government to play as well.
Great. Thank you, Eliza. Thank you, Rishi, Simon, and Meredith, for this very, very interesting panel discussion today. But also, I would like to thank everyone that has been attending this session. And actually, even though we're 4 past, there are so many of you still on the line. I hope you enjoyed this session as much as we did. Very, very interesting messages from everyone. And at this point, I would like to thank you for being here with us, and I would like to close this webinar and wish you a great day or evening wherever you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariantina, and lastly, thank you to Mariantina as well for moderating the webinar too. You were great, and thanks to our panelists too. We'll be all the recordings will be out to you in the next couple of days or so, so you'll be able to listen back to the discussion. And thank you all for listening, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Bye.
Bye.